The knocking came just as the wind reached its worst, sharp and urgent, cutting through the howl of the storm like a warning. Caleb Morgan froze in the middle of his cabin, the fire snapping behind him, his hand already moving toward the rifle he kept within reach. No one came this high in the mountains during winter. No one sane, at least. Up here, a knock on the door usually meant trouble, or a ghost from a life better left buried. The knock came again, faster this time. Caleb stood still, listening. Snow hammered the walls, and the wind shoved at the door as if it meant to tear it loose. Then he heard a voice, weak, strained, almost lost beneath the storm. "Please, we don't have anywhere else." He hadn't heard a woman's voice in months, maybe longer. The sound of it stirred something he'd worked hard to bury. He told himself to stay where he was, to let the storm answer for him. But his boots were already moving across the rough floor. When he pulled the door open, the cold rushed in like an invading force. A woman stood on the porch, her coat thin and dusted white, her face pale from the cold. She held a small girl against her side, wrapped tight in a blanket, and a boy stood in front of her, trying and failing to look brave. Snow clung to their hair and lashes. They looked more like something the storm had spat out than people. "Sir," the woman said, her voice shaking, "please, we just need a place to warm up. Just for the night." Caleb's eyes went first to the trees behind them, then to the slope below the cabin. No lanterns, no movement. Still, the mountains had taught him not to trust quiet. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice sounded rough, unused. "This storm'll kill you." The boy spoke before the woman could answer. It almost did, Caleb hesitated. Every instinct he had told him to shut the door, bar it, and let the past stay buried. He'd come up here to be alone, to make sure no one depended on him again. But the girl shivered, and the woman's knees buckled just slightly as she leaned against the doorframe. He stepped aside. "Get in. Now." They stumbled inside, and Caleb slammed the door shut behind them, driving the bolt home as the wind howled in protest. The warmth of the fire hit them all at once. The girl whimpered softly, and the woman pulled her closer. "I'm Sarah," she said after a moment. "This is Tommy. And Lily." Caleb nodded once. He didn't offer his name. He poured water into a pot and set it over the fire, his movements careful, controlled. He could feel their eyes on him, measuring, hoping. Trust was a dangerous thing to give away, especially up here. Tommy's gaze never left the rifle. Are you alone?" the boy asked. "Yes." Sarah swallowed. "We won't stay long, just until the storm passes." Caleb didn't answer. He watched the way her hands shook as she tried to warm them, the way she positioned herself between the children and him without even thinking about it. That told him more than words could. After a while, when the worst of the cold had eased from their bones, Sarah spoke again. "They're looking for us." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Who is they?" "Men," she said. "From the valley. They work for Richard Blake." The name meant nothing to the children, but it meant something to Caleb. He'd heard it before, spoken with bitterness in trading posts and towns he avoided. A man with money, a man who didn't like being told no. "He says we owe him," Sarah continued. "My husband borrowed money before he died. Blake says the debt didn't die with him." "And you ran," Caleb said. She nodded, because what he wanted wasn't money. Silence settled heavily between them. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin something else stirred, an old, familiar weight in Caleb's chest. He'd seen this kind of fear before. He'd seen what men like Blake did when they thought the world owed them obedience. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I know," Sarah replied, "but the mountains were the only place left." Caleb looked at the children, at the way Lily had finally fallen asleep by the fire, her small hand clutching her mother's coat. He thought of the promise he'd made to himself years ago, standing over fresh graves, that he would never let this happen again. Outside, far down the slope, something moved between the trees, a shadow, barely visible through the blowing snow. Caleb reached for his rifle. The mountains had found him after all. Morning did not bring peace. It only brought light, and light made it easier to see how close danger really was. Caleb stood at the small window, watching the tree line through drifting snow. The storm had eased during the night, but the cold remained sharp and unforgiving. Fresh tracks cut across the slope below the cabin. Bootprints. Several of them. They were not old. Behind him, Sarah sat near the fire, pulling Tommy's coat tighter around his shoulders. Lily slept curled against her, worn out from fear more than the cold. Sarah hadn't slept at all. Every sound outside made her tense. Every pause stretched too long. "They found us," she said quietly. Caleb didn't answer right away. He crouched and touched the edge of one track where it passed close to the porch. The snow had barely settled back into it. Whoever made it hadn't been in a hurry. That worried him more than speed ever could. "They're scouting," he said. "Seeing who I am, seeing what I'll do." Tommy looked up. "Will they come inside?" Caleb met the boy's eyes. He did not lie. "If they think they can." The cabin felt smaller now. The walls that once meant safety felt thin, temporary. Caleb had built this place to disappear, not to stand his ground. He moved through the room, checking the door, the windows, the few supplies he kept stacked neatly along the wall. Enough food for himself. Not enough for 4 people if this turned into a wait. A branch snapped outside. Sarah's breath caught. Caleb raised a hand, signaling for quiet. He stepped to the door and opened it just enough to look out. 2 men stood among the trees, far enough away to think they were unseen. They wore heavy coats, carried rifles low, and spoke casually, as if this were a simple errand. One of them laughed. The sound carried clearly in the thin mountain air. Caleb closed the door again. His face had gone hard, the way it used to when decisions came fast and carried weight. "They won't rush it," he said. "They'll wait. Maybe try to scare us out." "And if that doesn't work?" Sarah asked. "They'll try something else." Silence filled the cabin again. The fire popped softly. Lily stirred but did not wake. Sarah stood. "This is my fault," she said. "You didn't ask for this." Caleb shook his head once. Fault doesn't matter now. He looked around the cabin, at the life he had chosen. Solitude had been his shield, distance his protection. But shields crack, and distance disappears when others step into it. "They won't stop," Sarah said. "Richard Blake doesn't let go once he thinks something belongs to him." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had hoped the mountains were far enough for men like Blake. He had been wrong. "Hiding here won't work," Caleb said. "Not long term." Sarah looked at him, fear and hope tangled together. "Then what do we do?" He took a breath. This was the moment he'd avoided for years. The moment where staying meant more danger than leaving. "There's a pass east of here," he said. "Hard to cross in winter, but it leads down toward Pine River." Tommy's eyes widened. "That's far." "Yes," Caleb said. "And dangerous." Sarah hesitated. "We can't make it. Not with the kids." "I can," Caleb replied. She understood immediately. "You'd leave us?" "I'd come back," he said, "with help." The idea hung between them, fragile and terrifying. If he failed, they would be alone. If he stayed, they would all be cornered. "I don't like it," Sarah said, "but I don't see another choice." Caleb knelt in front of Tommy. "You listen to your mother. You don't open the door for anyone. You hear me?" Tommy nodded, trying to be strong. Caleb packed quickly. Rope. Extra rounds. Food enough for a fast journey. He pulled on his heavy coat and paused at the door, feeling the familiar weight settle into his chest. This was the same feeling he'd had years ago, stepping into places where mistakes cost more than pride. Sarah stepped closer. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Caleb looked at Lily, still sleeping, her face peaceful for the first time since arriving. "Because once," he said quietly, "I didn't." He opened the door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and final. Outside, the mountains waited, indifferent and vast. As Caleb stepped into the snow and closed the door behind him, the men in the trees shifted their positions. The hunt had begun. Caleb moved through the mountains like a shadow shaped by habit and memory. Snow reached his knees in places, and the wind cut across the ridges with steady force, but he did not slow. Each step toward the pass carried him farther from the cabin and closer to a life he had sworn to leave behind. He told himself this was just a task. Go to Pine River. Find help. Come back. Nothing more. The pass rose ahead of him, narrow and unforgiving. One wrong step meant a long fall into white silence. As he climbed, his breathing grew heavy, not just from the effort, but from the thoughts pressing in. He remembered another winter, years ago, when he had followed orders instead of judgment. He had told himself then that doing nothing was safer than doing what felt right. That memory stayed with him, sharp and unwelcome. Halfway up the pass, Caleb stopped. Fresh tracks crossed his path. Not old. His hand went to his rifle without thought. Blake's men were moving faster than he had expected. He changed direction, cutting across exposed rock where the wind had stripped the snow thin. The cold burned his face, but he welcomed it. Pain kept the past quiet. By late afternoon, the land began to fall away, the peaks giving way to lower ground. Pine River appeared below, a small town pressed between forest and river, smoke rising from chimneys like signs of life. Caleb felt no relief. Towns brought people. People brought questions. He reached the edge of Pine River as dusk settled. Horses were tied outside the general store, and voices drifted through the cold air. Caleb kept his head down and went straight to the small medical office near the center of town. A lantern glowed inside. "Doctor," Henry Fields looked up as Caleb entered. "You look like you crossed half the world," the doctor said. "Feels like it," Caleb replied. Fields studied him for a moment, then closed the door. "Sit. Warm up." As Caleb explained, Fields's expression changed from curiosity to concern. "Richard Blake again," he said quietly. "I've heard stories. I'll come with you." Caleb hesitated. Bringing someone else into this meant responsibility. It meant if things went wrong, he wouldn't be alone to answer for it. But time was running out. They left before sunrise. The return trip was harder. The weather turned against them, and more than once they had to stop and wait out gusts strong enough to knock a man off his feet. At one narrow stretch, Fields slipped. Caleb caught him just in time, gripping his coat with frozen fingers. "You could still turn back," Caleb said. Fields shook his head. "Not after hearing about those children." They reached the ridge above the cabin late the next day. Smoke still rose from the chimney. That was a good sign, but something felt wrong. Caleb moved ahead alone. As he crept closer, he saw one of Blake's men tied to a post near the porch, his rifle lying several feet away. The man glared, his pride hurt more than his body. Inside the cabin, Sarah stood holding Caleb's rifle. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. "He tried to come in alone," she said. "Tommy dropped the lantern like you showed him. We caught him off balance." Tommy stood nearby, pale but standing tall. Lily clutched her mother's coat. Caleb felt something twist in his chest. Pride mixed with fear. He had left them alone, and they had been forced to act. This was the cost of his choice. "You did right," Caleb said, though the words felt heavy. The captured man spoke then, his tone polite in a way that felt practiced. "Mr. Blake won't like this," he said calmly. "But he's reasonable. You just need to hand over the woman, and everyone walks away." Caleb looked at him, seeing the easy confidence of someone used to getting his way. For a moment he imagined how simple it would be to agree. How clean. How final. Then he looked at the children. "No," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it did not waver. That night, as the wind returned and the fire burned low, Caleb sat awake. He realized this was no longer about helping and leaving. Every step forward pulled him deeper into a fight he could not walk away from. In the mountains outside, unseen eyes watched the cabin lights, and Caleb knew the next choice would cost even more than the last. By the time dawn reached the cabin, the sense of waiting had become unbearable. The captured man sat silent now, his earlier confidence fading as the hours passed. Outside, the mountains were calm in a way that felt false, as if they were holding their breath. Caleb stood near the door, tightening the straps on his pack. He had already made the decision, though it weighed heavier than the last journey. Going to Pine River had been about finding help. This time was about bringing the law itself into a place where men like Richard Blake believed it did not reach. Sarah watched him closely. "You're leaving again," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Caleb replied. "There's a marshal who works the road south of Pine River, Thomas Reed. If anyone can stop Blake, it's him." "And if you don't make it back?" she asked. Caleb met her eyes. "Then you take the children and go east when the weather breaks. Don't wait." Sarah nodded slowly, though the fear was clear on her face. "You're risking everything." "So are you," he said gently. Caleb stepped outside and started up the trail before doubt could catch him. The second crossing felt longer, steeper. His body was already tired, his joints stiff from cold and effort. But something else pushed him forward now. It wasn't just duty. It was the knowledge that turning away would mean accepting the world Blake wanted. The road lay miles beyond the pass, a narrow line carved through forest and rock. Caleb reached it near dusk and followed it, until he spotted a small campfire burning beside a wagon. 2 deputies stood nearby, their coats marked with dust and travel. Territorial Marshal Thomas Reed rose as Caleb approached. Reed was broad-shouldered, his face lined from sun and wind, his eyes sharp but steady. "You look like a man who didn't walk all this way for nothing," Reed said. Caleb told him everything: the debt, the threats, the children, Blake's men in the mountains. Reed listened without interruption. When Caleb finished, the marshal nodded once. "Blake's been skirting the edge of the law for years," he said. "Sounds like he finally stepped over it." They moved at first light. Reed brought 3 deputies, men who understood that the job did not end where comfort did. The climb was hard on them, but they did not complain. When they reached the ridge overlooking the cabin, smoke still rose from the chimney. Blake's men were already there. 2 stood near the tree line, and another paced near the porch, impatient. They turned as Reed and his deputies stepped into view. "Morning," Reed called calmly. "Drop your weapons." One man laughed. "You're a long way from town, Marshal." Reed's expression did not change. "So are you." The deputies moved with purpose, positioning themselves before anyone could think too long. Faced with the badges and the calm certainty behind them, the men hesitated. Then one by one, they complied. Sarah opened the door slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief as she saw the marshal. Tommy gripped her hand. Lily peeked from behind her coat. Reed spoke to the captured man next, who tried once more to sound reasonable. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said. "Mr. Blake will clear it up." Reed shook his head. "We'll hear it from him directly." By midday, the men were bound and ready to be taken down the mountain. Reed sent 1 deputy ahead with word to Pine River, then turned to Caleb. "You did the right thing," Reed said. "Not everyone would." Caleb watched as the deputies led the men away. The danger that had pressed in on the cabin for days finally eased. The air felt lighter, though exhaustion settled deep into his bones. Before leaving, Reed spoke with Sarah. He explained the debt had no legal ground. that Blake's actions would be answered for. Her shoulders sagged with relief she had been holding back for too long. As the marshal's group disappeared down the trail, Caleb stood in the quiet that followed. He knew this was not the end of the road, but it was a turning point. The mountains no longer felt like a hiding place. They felt like something he had crossed and survived. The quiet that followed felt unfamiliar, not the heavy silence of hiding, but something softer, uncertain. Snow still covered the ground, and the mountains stood as they always had, tall and unmoved. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Caleb packed his few belongings without hurry. The rifle went last, wrapped carefully. He paused more than once, looking around the small room that had been his whole world for so long. Every wall, every mark on the table held years of chosen distance. This place had kept him alive, but it had also kept him apart. Sarah watched from the doorway. The children sat nearby, whispering to each other, their voices lighter now. The fear that had followed them into the mountains had finally loosened its grip. "They'll come back?" Tommy asked. "The bad men?" "No," Sarah said before Caleb could answer. "They won't." Caleb nodded. "The marshal will handle the rest." Lily stepped closer to Caleb, holding a small bundle of cloth. She offered it to him without a word. Inside was a piece of bread she had saved. "For the road," she said softly. Caleb knelt to her level. "Thank you." It struck him then how easily the children trusted him. That trust carried weight. He stood, feeling it settle into him, heavier than his pack. They left the cabin just after sunrise. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that only came after hard weather. The trail down the mountain wound between trees and rock, familiar to Caleb but new to the others. He took the lead, setting a steady pace, watching for slick ground. Sarah followed, her steps careful but sure. She had walked for days in fear, but now there was purpose in her stride. Every few minutes, she looked back at the cabin, then forward again, as if letting go and holding on at the same time. Halfway down, they stopped to rest. The valley opened before them, wide and bright. Roads cut through the land below, leading to places where people lived, argued, worked, and moved on. Life, waiting. "This is where we turn back if you want," Caleb said. The words surprised him as he spoke them. Sarah shook her head. "No," she said. "I don't want my children growing up looking over their shoulders." Tommy glanced up at Caleb. "Are you coming with us?" The question landed hard. Caleb had asked himself the same thing since the marshal left. He had told himself he was only walking them part of the way, that he belonged in the mountains. That was the plan he had made to protect himself. But plans had a way of breaking when faced with real people. "Yes," Caleb said at last. "I am." The rest of the walk felt different, lighter. When they reached the main road, the sound of distant wagons carried on the wind. Pine River lay beyond the trees, and beyond that, places Caleb had avoided for years. They paused one last time. The mountains rose behind them, silent witnesses. Caleb felt a pull there, the old habit of retreat. But he also felt something else now, steady and unfamiliar. Sarah extended her hand. "Thank you," she said, "not just for protection, but for the choice he had made." Caleb took it. "We'll figure out the rest," he replied. He didn't know how, but for the first time that uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. They started down the road together. As the mountains faded behind them, Caleb glanced back once. The cabin was already hidden by distance and trees, returning to what it had always been. Wood and stone, nothing more. Ahead, the children laughed at something small and unimportant. Sarah smiled at the sound. Caleb walked with them, his steps matching theirs. He had gone into the mountains to disappear. He came out with something worth being seen for,